My name is Jean Patterson. I'm a member of the congregation, and it's my privilege to welcome you all today to All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church. I was so pleased when I walked in and saw all the member art in the library, in the lobby, and the new Christmas decorations. We look so welcoming and festive, and so we want to welcome specifically any guests or visitors. So if you are a guest or a visitor, please stand, tell us your name and where you're from. Let us greet you. Yes.
I'm Dana. This is my son, Caleb. And we're from Independence.
Well, welcome. Glad you're here. Yes. Great. Welcome. Others? Well, we're so glad you're with us today. Somebody's pointing at somebody. I don't see anybody. Well, I'm coming to that. We also have our first Yule Bach after the service. And Yule Bachs are our holiday parties. So if you're a guest or a visitor, or of course you members know, cross the parking lot to the Simpson House and join us for conversation and lots of good food and drinks. Okay? We also want to acknowledge those of you who are watching us live stream. You can't go across to Simpson House, and I'm sorry about that. We have some other guests today, and Anthony will introduce them.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm very excited this morning to have the Avila Chamber Orchestra with us from Avila University under the direction of Dr. Mihalis Koutsoupadis. You may recognize Mihalis. He's been here with us many times. He is a gracious sub for me, and he's been a violinist and a keyboard player with us for our Music Sundays. This group started as a string quartet. You can see they've grown. Yeah. And now they function as a group that plays for many things at the university, and their primary focus is for outreach for the university, and we're very happy they're here this morning. Help me welcome them.
Good morning and welcome here on the threshold of this holiday season as the days darken toward solstice and the turning of the year. We gather in the covenant community of memory and promise. The hurry and greed and tension by which we are surrounded is real. And yet we set this hour apart to bring to mind the best ideals of our humanity, to acknowledge gratitude for the beauties and wonders of life, to confess the daunting perplexities of our world and our own failures of nerve, to seek comfort as we mourn the loss and pain that are part of our days, to renew our courage in the struggle for better justice and compassion, to remind one another yet again that in the journey of living, we are not alone. May our honest consideration of the duties and challenges of our times offer you food for thought and action, and may this moment of quiet centering nurture your inner light and give you peace. May creative power rise up in you, grounding you and guiding you to the edges of what is yet possible for you and those close to you and the world. In token of that creative power rising within us, giving energy to our community and to people of goodwill everywhere, we kindle this chalice flame. Let its light and warmth connect us with one another and call us to rededicate our minds and lives to truth and justice, to the promise of a better world and the persistence of love.
My name is Sierra, and I light this chalice for respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part.
Let's try this again. Thank you, Sierra. Now let's rise together and speak once again the words of our covenant promise to one another. Together we affirm, goodwill is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And would you remain standing for our opening song?
Silent word is pleading.
The Advent candle is a gesture of expectation, affirming that novelty can break into the world and change everything, whether or not we are ready for it. Over the centuries, those who have sought justice for the oppressed and enslaved have often been told, "You may be right, but people are not ready for this." They told the abolitionists, "We are not ready to free the slaves." They told the suffragists, "We are not ready to let women or colored people vote." They told the integrationists, "We are not ready for racial equality." Today they say, "We are not ready to let go of white privilege." But Advent tells us that freedom is coming, ready or not. Advent looks to the dawn of a new day, a new world that we have waited for a long time, but never yet seen. The Advent candle is our promise to keep that hope alive in our hearts and never stop believing in the possibility of justice and freedom and peace. And now we will invite the children to head off to their classes with song.
Go now in peace, may love guide all your ways. Beauty be the blessing of your nights and days. Truth on your lips and kindness in your deeds. Faith to follow where the human spirit leads.
Now let us enter into a spirit of meditation with these words. Listen to the long stillness. New life is stirring. New dreams are on the wing. New hopes are being readied. Humankind is fashioning a new heart. Humankind is forging a new mind. Creation is at work. This is the season of promise. will you join me in once again the words of Howard Thurman? Listen to the long stillness. New life is stirring. New dreams are on the wing. New hopes are being readied. Humankind is fashioning a new heart. Humankind is forging a new mind. Creation is at work. This is the season of promise. The flaming chalice that we light each week connects us to Unitarian Universalist congregations across the United States and Canada. What you may not know is that this chalice connects us also to the work of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. This organization was started by the work of Unitarian ministers and organizers in the 1940s to help people in Europe escape from Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime. Our former minister, Ray Bragg, was one of its early leaders. This was the first UU organization to create the image of the flaming chalice as its official logo. Today, the UU Service Committee works in more than 20 countries around the globe, as well as here in the US, to support communities of people in the most desperate need. Working always with local partner organizations who are aware of the most specific needs and resources, the UUSC is helping refugee families at the US border stay together and file asylum claims effectively. They are partnering with women's organizations and journalists in Honduras to confront violence and human rights violations. They are delivering humanitarian aid among minority Rohingya villages in Burma and documenting atrocities there for the International Criminal Court. They support 5 eco villages and a school for 172 students on the Central Plateau in Haiti, as well as working with Syrian refugees and people displaced by Hurricane Harvey. UUSC involvement always seeks to develop local leadership and to respond to communities that may either be disenfranchised by their government or ignored by larger aid organizations like the Red Cross and others. These may include women, youth, indigenous peoples, or LGBTQ groups. When a natural disaster like a flood or hurricane happens, the committee reaches out to existing advocate groups to learn how to help respond most usefully to the greatest needs for the long-term good of the community. UUSC workers do these gritty, unglamorous tasks even when the world's attention shifts and the TV cameras go somewhere else. And they do it on a financial shoestring. It's a bit as though we were trying to run our emergency warming center 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This month, we have the opportunity to make that shoestring a little more robust and dependable through our contributions to our UU Service Committee. While our minds are filled with thoughts of gifts for those we love, I invite you to consider sharing a portion of your seasonal generosity with the specific work of our faith in the world by a gift to the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. The offering for this morning will now be given and gratefully received. Will you join me now in the words of dedication for our offering? We dedicate our offerings and our actions to the mission at the heart of this congregation, to build a respectful, caring community, to inspire personal and spiritual growth, and to create change toward a just and compassionate society.
The passage I'm about to read from Black author Carol Anderson contains quotations from African American speakers who unselfconsciously use an offensive term to describe how they were viewed in a racist culture. We believe that it is important to remember how even language has been used to commit violence against people of color, and we choose not to soften their words. From White Rage by Carol Anderson. By 1920, there had been more than 1,000 lynchings per decade, and in the former rebel South, almost 90% of those killed were African Americans. 5 states, Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, accounted for more than half of all lynchings in the nation. One of the most macabre formats for the murders was a spectacle lynching, which advertised the killing of a Black person and provided special promotional trains to bring the audience, including women and children, to the slaughter. These gruesome events were standard family entertainment. Severed body parts became souvenirs, and decorations hung proudly in homes. Ambition was forbidden. African Americans knew all too well the Dixie limit beyond which no Black could advance. Ned Cobb, a Black farmer and former sharecropper, complained, quote, "Whenever the colored man prospered too fast in this country, they worked every figure to cut you down, cut your britches off you," end quote. He understood that his success, indeed the fact that he had acquired some land and managed to not be in debt to local whites, made him a threat. Quote, "They looked hard, didn't stop looking. They didn't like to see a nigger with too much. They didn't like it one bit, and it caused them to throw a slang word about a nigger having all this, that, and the other. Whites," Cobb complained, "just hated to see niggers living like people," end quote. Similarly, an Alpharetta, Georgia farmer who just wanted to be free and vote free explained that the South was no place for an honest, hardworking, ambitious man. Quote, "Better not accumulate much," he warned, "because no matter how hard and honest you work for it, you can't enjoy it," end quote. In that stammer lay the bone-chilling truth that signs of prosperity could attract night riders and the bloodletting, torture, and land seizing that inevitably followed. In several Georgia and Mississippi counties, where plantations did not dominate the economy, local whites maimed, murdered, and terrorized African Americans, and, as the persecuted fled, seized all the land until one could ride for miles and not see a Black face.
From Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. I believe that so much of our worst thinking about justice is steeped in the myths of racial difference that still plague us. I believe that there are 4 institutions in American history that have shaped our approach to race and justice, but remain poorly understood. The first, of course, is slavery. This is followed by the reign of terror that shapes the lives of people of color following the collapse of Reconstruction until World War II. Older people of color in the South would occasionally come up to me after speeches to complain about how antagonized they feel when they hear news commentators talking about how we were dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in the United States after the 9/11 attacks. An older African-American man once said to me, "You make them stop saying that. We grew up with terrorism all the time. The police, the Klan, anybody who was white could terrorize you. We had to worry about bombings and lynchings, racial violence of all kinds." The racial terrorism of lynching in many ways created the modern death penalty. America's embrace of speedy executions was, in part, an attempt to redirect the violent energies of lynching while assuring white Southerners that black men would still pay the ultimate price. Racial terror and the constant threat created by violently enforced racial hierarchy were profoundly traumatizing for African Americans. Absorbing these psychosocial realities created all kinds of distortions and difficulties that manifest themselves today in multiple ways.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop bitter
We don't do generals on horseback anymore, or allegorical goddesses draped in flowing garments. Ours is a culture of frenetic music videos and memes designed to appear on a cell phone and be forgotten a moment later. Nothing as static as marble statues for us. We have no appetite for the unmoving, for the larger-than-life scale, or for the permanent. Having little popular consensus about what we ought to be inspired by, we have no taste for public monuments, no collective hunger for grandeur. If we are lucky, we inherit the successful statuary of previous generations, an iconic World War I museum that defines the city skyline. At worst, we get to yell at each other about Confederate heroes immortalized in the flower of their racism in bronze on the courthouse lawn. Our contemporary attempts at public statuary are too often derivative, commercial, or self-satirical. We are too often unwilling to subsume our own personal taste in the service of an art that expresses truth on behalf of a larger community. Which makes it all the more stunning when a contemporary work of art succeeds in being overwhelmingly grand and permanent and inspiring, expressive with no hint of sentimentality, and intense with no hint of irony. It begins both innocently and ominously, like the Rod Serling introduction to an episode of The Twilight Zone. Just some names, a few historical facts out in the Alabama sunshine. You know this stuff already. It's a bygone era after all. Nothing to be afraid of. It's green, like a pleasant park, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, blandly suggesting something along the lines of Arlington National Cemetery, with marble tombs and eternal flames and all that. The kiosk, where you buy your ticket, is down at the base of the entrance walkway, shaded and cool and welcoming. The walkway slopes up to the level of the lawn and up again to the entrance to the memorial. You see them as you enter the structure, textured steel columns, almost like direction kiosks in any big city metro. Rising out of the floor, human in scale, names cut into the metal at eye level. Glancing past the first few, you start to realize how many columns there are, like a great forest. And you know that you would never be able to give each one of them the full attention and respect that it deserves from you, sadly. This is your first clue that something may be about to happen to you here that you didn't exactly bargain for. something that not all the museums and timelines of the past few days have prepared you for. Without a sound, the columns draw you in, remind you that they represent not individual men, women, and children who died by lynching between 1877 and 1950, but counties where those lynchings took place. A few of them bear only one name, starkly cut through the steel, ineffaceable, testifying to the unique life ended in terror and violence in that place. Others, though, are all but lacy with cut-out names and date after date after date. Places where lynching was a way of life for white citizens and a way of death for their black neighbors. It was dry and hot the day we were there, but the roof structure gives shade, not protection from the weather, and I am told that when it does rain, the columns get wet and drip rusty stains like blood onto the floor. Support poles run through the columns up to the roof structure. As you enter, the sight lines are orderly, the columns neatly aligned, blue sky visible beyond the wall-less building from all directions. But as you move ahead from one row of columns to the next, you begin to realize that the floor is falling away beneath your feet. You are headed downhill, yet the columns remain level. There is starting to be a gap between them and the floor. They are, in fact, suspended from those central poles. And that word suspended has a sudden, ghastly connotation. By now, you have made the first right-hand turn, moving perpendicular to the path that brought you into the forest of columns, and there is starting to be a foundation wall as the building descends into the ground. You have to crane your neck to see people's names on the columns at this point, and you can notice that the bottoms of the columns are not open, but also steel, engraved with the name of the county that it represents. And you notice that they look rather like coffins. And this is probably not an accident either. As you move ever downward, the foundation wall lengthens and begins to display captions offering sparse details about some of the lynchings. Killed for carrying a photograph of a white woman. Hanged for refusing a white man's bid to buy his crops. Burned alive for protesting her husband's murder. As you get to the third turn, the columns are almost overhead, and they remind you of bells in a huge carillon. If you tap one hard with your knuckles, it gives off a dull, ominous resonance, like a stifled moan. What would the sound be like if they could all be tapped like that at once or in sequence? Could human hearing bear it? Reaching the lowest point of the structure produces a feeling of panic, almost of being trapped. All around you is dim now. The blue sky is far away above your head. Although light is streaming through the exit to your left, it feels somehow dishonorable to flee impetuously into the waiting lawns and sunshine. The inner wall is lined with a bench from which it is easier to gaze up into the columns, now hanging far overhead. This was the position from which the white audience viewed the results of a lynching, the strange fruit that Billie Holiday sang about with such raw grief and passion. It was also the position from which people of color viewed the remains of their sons and fathers, their loved ones and neighbors. The bodies were often left on increasingly grim display for days as a taunt and a message of intimidation. To cut them down was a punishable offense, which just might have something to do with why it was so unendurable that Michael Brown's body was left lying uncovered in the street for 4 long hours on an August afternoon. It is at such moments that humanism is a most challenging faith. And yet, how is anyone entitled to pray Kyrie eleison when there was no mercy whatsoever among the children of humankind when these deeds were done, when these deeds are done in our own day, in our own names, as citizens of this nation? The great rusty metal boxes are suspended, not only in space, but also in time. There is nothing to be done about them now. The cruelty and evil that they represent remains real no matter what happens next. We have no power to restore those lives, to rescind this suffering. Even to pray in this place feels trivializing, a turning away from the one divine command, behold. And why should our prayers of anguish be heard when theirs, fervent and desperate, so clearly were not? The essence of the American nightmare is distilled here to something essential. All the whipping posts and chains of slavery, all the cross burnings and convict leasing of the postbellum South, all the indignities and violence of Jim Crow, all the redlining and exploitation and segregation and suppression of the entire 20th century, all the 400 years of enforced ignorance and intentional generational poverty and stolen labor and legal injustice, gathers witness here amidst the names of those whose blood was poured out to slake the white thirst for privilege. All you can do is stand there and let that awareness soak deep into your soul, as the blood of black folks once soaked into the roots of the poplar trees. And if it does not change you, there is no hope for your salvation. Which is the question I carried with me out into the intense July sunshine. What is it that we must do to be saved? Both from the haunting of these unbearable memories and from our congenital human capacity to be complicit in repeating them. And behold, the art of this memorial offers an explicit answer to that question in a brilliant, exquisite refrain. For every one of those 800 columns lies exactly replicated in the park-like grass, row upon row of incised, oversized coffins, each holding a county-sized portion of America's decomposing dream of equality and freedom. They shouldn't be there, these second caskets. They are waiting. They are waiting to be claimed by the county in question. They are waiting to be retrieved by the community they represent, to be given a place of sorrow and honor among the heirs of the people who did these things that no one now wants to remember. The authorities of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice are hoping to send them away, to create a national network of these reminders in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, in Lowndes County, Georgia, in Shelby County, Texas, in Macon County, Illinois, in Jackson County, Missouri. There are 3,142 counties in the United States. I looked it up. There are 800 columns bearing the names of Black people lynched over the course of 8 decades in this country, which means that 1/4 of all the counties in the nation, including the one in which this church is located, have peace and justice memorials waiting for them. I know ours is there. In the heat of a southern summer afternoon, I searched and found it, touched it. Organizations in some 30 of those counties have already expressed interest in receiving their columns. And the folks at Equal Justice Initiative, by whom the memorial was designed and built, are working on the protocols for releasing the replicas to their communities. So when you finally exit, stunned and blinking, to wander across this symbolic graveyard, there is no need for a polite little sign suggesting that you carry this message back home with you, that you connect with your local neighbors, that you continue to educate yourself and others. Every part of that process is implicit in the question that radiates from a steel box engraved with names, waiting with the fathomless patience, dignity, and poignancy of justice long denied for your answer. Will you own me? Will you bring me home with you? Will you make again the sound of our names, resurrect our memories in the place where our lives were stolen? History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, says Maya Angelou, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. This is what it looks like to face our collective history with courage, so that we might bequeath to our children a legacy of wrenching pain that need not be lived again. So let me ask you this. Do you know his name? It's not a long list for Jackson County, it's one name. 1882 was the year they strung him up from the Bluff Street Bridge and riddled his black body with bullets. Don't be embarrassed, I had to look it up again myself. But now that I think about it, it seems like the least we can do, wouldn't you say? To carry that one name in our collective memory, to remember the dismembered of our own town. There's a marker in the park at the corner of Summit and West 10th Street, in case you forget. Levi Harrington was his name. He was a caring husband and father of 5 children. Which is part of the point, by the way. The whole concept of lynching served 3 basic purposes, none of which was actual justice. The first object was to create generational communal trauma. Levi himself, had he survived the ordeal, might have been angry, vengeful, radicalized. His wife and children and neighbors were simply terrorized. It's harder to learn, to be creative, to take risks, to form trusting relationships, to believe in yourself when your body and brain experience that kind of traumatic shock, especially when no one talks about it or processes it or even acknowledges that it ever happened. The potential ambitions of Black individuals and Black communities were shut down by these acts of arbitrary terror. At the same time, it wasn't always entirely arbitrary. A significant percentage of lynching victims, like the victims of witch burnings centuries before, were people in the way of some more powerful individuals' financial interests, or who refused to succumb to the systems of sharecropping and debt that reduced Black families to hereditary peonage. If a white property owner wanted land that a Black owner was not eager to sell, it was easier to accuse him or her of any kind of trumped-up crime and appropriate the property once the victim was disposed of. As Carol Anderson described in the reading we just heard, there was an understood limit on how prosperous a Black person was allowed to be or appear. Looking like you had too much was as much of a provocation as direct discourtesy to a white person, and just as likely to bring down the wrath of the lynch mob. You might remember how Fannie Lou Hamer grew up in a sharecropping family whose cow and mule were poisoned by a white neighbor offended by their attempts to get ahead. But the greatest appeal of lynching lay in its performance of white power and supremacy. It was a community drama and ritual that had the advantage of terrifying Black folks, but its real intended audience was resentful whites who could tolerate their own social and economic disadvantages as long as they had the opportunity to release their rage onto Black bodies. Any number of studies have shown that the idea of supremacy is easily implanted in the human mind on the arbitrary basis of eye color or camp teams or even randomly assigned identities. There is something in us that readily latches on to this notion that others deserve less than we do and must not be allowed to get away with treating our group badly, that they value life and experience pain less intensely than we do because we are naturally superior, and that their suffering is a legitimate source of amusement and gratification. It is seen in the crudest grade school bullying, and I'm inclined to believe that it does not, in fact, have to be carefully taught. My observation is that it comes all too naturally. And it is always a lie. Hear me now. It is always a lie, every time. A lifelong, constant practice is needed to rid our minds of this tendency, or even to learn to recognize it when it presents itself again in some new costume. The only way to wake from the American nightmare of racism is to learn that this lesson is never self-sustaining. It must be taught again and again in every generation. And the inoculations must be thorough because the virus lies dormant in every human consciousness, in yours, I promise you, and mine, just waiting for the chance of a new epidemic. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice is a profoundly powerful text in the service of that lesson. And so, if you read it right, is the story of Jesus, born in precarious circumstances, in a land whose king would slaughter infants in their mother's arms in order to ensure his hold on power. Jesus, the messenger of healing and community, dying in the grasp of religious and political supremacy that dared not countenance his liberating love. Light your candles, people, whatever candles you have. Sing the carols of love alive in the world and the dirges of those whose pain and death went to feed insatiable supremacy. Remember the name of Levi Harrington. Shall we bring his memory home here to our city? Shall we indeed turn and face into the wrenching pain of our history so that the babies in the mangers of today need not relive it? I don't know the answer, but I wonder. In this season of promise and waiting and stirring hope, I wonder.
Jesus had wanted for any wee thing, a star in the sky or a bird on the wing, or all of God's angels in heaven for to sing, he surely could have it, 'cause he was the King. I wonder as I wander out under the sky, if goodwill and peace come from heaven on high, how many of God's human children must die? I wonder as I wander out under the sky.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fires of commitment. For all these we carry in our minds and hearts until we are together again. Now, holy is light in the dark days. Holy is the evergreen in the desolate season. Holy is warmth in the frozen months. Birth is light to the time of despair. Courage is light to the age of oppression. Fellowship is light in the days of dread. May we carry away the light and warmth of ancient celebrations of Yuletide in our minds and hearts. So be it.